The battle over Earth had reached its peak. Humanity had fought valiantly, but the enemy was too strong. The Zorath Imperium, an alien race with overwhelming technological superiority, had already crushed most of Earth's defenses, and their fleet now loomed in the black sky above the planet. Earth's remaining ships were scattered and outgunned. They could only delay the inevitable for so long. The humans had one last hope, a final stand to buy enough time for the last remaining civilian ships to escape the oncoming destruction, but the odds were against them. Captain Riley Mason stood at the bridge of the flagship Unity, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. It was a feeling he knew his crew shared. Even if they were outnumbered and outclassed, they would fight until the very end. The Zorath fleet was massive, and unlike anything the humans had ever seen, their ships glowed with deadly precision, each one more formidable than the last. The alien vessels surrounded Earth's fleet, cutting off any escape routes, while their weapons fired relentlessly into the human ships. It seemed as if there was no way out. But then a voice broke through the silence of the bridge. "Captain, there's something on the scanners." The voice of Lieutenant Sarah Jensen echoed from the operations station. Mason turned his gaze toward the young officer, her brow furrowed as she studied the radar screen, her fingers dancing across the controls. "Sir, we've got an unidentified vessel. It's coming from the asteroid field." Mason felt a pang of curiosity, mixed with doubt. "What kind of ship is it?" Jensen hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's small, really small, barely registering on the scanners, but it's moving fast, almost too fast, and it's heading straight toward the Zorath Armada." Mason narrowed his eyes. What kind of fool would be flying directly into the heart of enemy territory, especially in a ship that small? The odds of surviving were almost non-existent. "Track its course," Mason commanded. The bridge fell silent as everyone stared at the screen, watching as the tiny blip on the radar steadily closed in on the massive Zorath fleet. Jensen's hands flew over the controls, feeding Mason updates every few seconds. "Captain, it's getting closer," she reported. "It's not slowing down." Mason crossed his arms and thought for a moment. "What's its identification?" Jensen shook her head. "There's no record of it, sir. It's not one of ours. I don't think it's even a military vessel. That's not showing up in our database." "Is it human?" Mason asked. "I can't say for sure, sir," Jensen replied, "but it's coming from our side of the line, and it's definitely not a Zorath ship." Mason's mind raced. Could this be some kind of secret weapon, an unexpected surprise in the chaos of war, or was it simply a distraction, a way to buy time while the rest of humanity's fleet prepared to retreat? Whatever it was, Mason didn't have time to wait. He gripped the arm of his chair as he ordered his communications officer to hail the mysterious vessel. A crackling voice came through the comms. "This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen of the Titan's Wrath. We're going in hot." The voice crackled through the comms, and for a moment Captain Mason thought he heard wrong. The name of the ship caught him off guard. The Titan's Wrath. It was the name of an experimental prototype vessel humanity had developed, but it wasn't supposed to be deployed, not yet anyway. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen's voice was calm and confident, as if she were announcing a simple maneuver on a training exercise, not about to dive headfirst into the heart of an alien armada. "What in the world is going on?" Mason muttered under his breath. "Sir, I have visual on the ship." Lieutenant Jensen's voice cut in again. "It's a long shot, but we're doing what we can to hold off the enemy." Mason leaned forward, his mind racing. The Titan's Wrath was a ship unlike any other. It was not built for sheer firepower like the rest of humanity's ships. It was built for speed and agility, an experimental vessel meant to test new technology and tactics at the cutting edge. But it was still in its testing phase, far from ready for full-scale combat. How is she even holding together? Mason thought aloud. The Titan's Wrath wasn't designed for large-scale battles. Its hull was made of lighter materials to accommodate its advanced engines. It wasn't meant to withstand heavy fire from the Zorath fleet, yet somehow it was still flying. "Sir, we're getting reports from the Titan's Wrath. They're taking heavy damage, but the crew is holding steady," Jensen continued through the comms. "They've already disabled 2 Zorath cruisers and are using the asteroid field as cover to avoid their main fire." Mason's eyes widened. He had expected the ship to be destroyed within moments, But instead it was causing chaos among the Zoraith ranks. The alien fleet wasn't prepared for a vessel that didn't follow traditional combat protocols. "Keep me updated, Lieutenant." Mason ordered. He couldn't believe it, but a part of him felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. The humans were on the brink of destruction, yet here was this unexpected player shifting the tide even slightly. He turned toward his command officers and gave a sharp order. "We're not out yet. Gather all remaining forces. Get ready to move in support of the Titan's wrath." "Aye, sir," they replied in unison. The human fleet had been battered, but they weren't giving up. The Titan's wrath might be a miracle, or it might be a distraction, but it was a chance, something they hadn't had in days. The small vessel darted in and out of the asteroid field as it danced between fire from the Zoraith cruisers, dodging blasts, and returning fire with its limited arsenal. Human forces began to regroup around the Titan's wrath as it took down more and more Zoraith ships. The aliens began to panic. They hadn't expected this kind of fight from humans who had been written off as weak and insignificant. "They're underestimating us," Mason muttered to himself. "They've made a grave mistake." The ship's unexpected success gave the humans something they hadn't had in a long time, a reason to fight back, a glimmer of hope that even against impossible odds humanity might still have a chance to turn the tide. The Zoraith High Command was not a group easily rattled, but as they watched their ships fall one by one, their confidence began to crack. Their forces had been trained to expect victory, to overpower their enemies with sheer might, but the Titan's wrath and its crew were doing the unthinkable. Commander Zorthak, the leader of the Zoraith fleet, watched as his flagship's sensors lit up with alerts. The humans were proving far more resourceful than expected. They had no right to be this effective, but here they were outmaneuvering his fleet with a single ship that should have been torn apart within minutes. "This is unacceptable," Zorthak hissed as he slammed his fist down on a console. "All ships focus on that human vessel. Destroy it now." He turned toward his tactical officer. "Send in the elite squadron. They will take care of this nuisance once and for all." The elite squadron was a group of the Zoraith's finest pilots. Their ships were faster, more advanced, and their training was unrivaled. They would eliminate the Titan's wrath and end this human distraction. On the other side of the battlefield, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen was acutely aware of the shift in the Zoraith tactics. She had felt the change in their approach when the elite squadron appeared on her scanners. Their ships were closing in fast. She had barely enough time to prepare her crew for what was coming. "Hold steady," Jensen said, her voice calm but tense as the lights on the bridge flickered with the incoming barrage of energy pulses. "We're not out of this yet." The crew of the Titan's wrath readied themselves for the inevitable. The ship had already taken heavy damage. Its shields were failing and its engines were beginning to overheat, but they were not giving up. Jensen knew that the longer they could keep the Zoraith focused on them, the more time they would buy for the rest of humanity's fleet. "We're not retreating," she muttered under her breath. Her crew nodded in silent agreement. The elite squadron descended upon them in perfect formation, but Jensen was prepared. She had anticipated this move, and now she had to make the impossible happen. With a series of quick commands, she pushed the Titan's wrath to its limits. The small ship darted between the Zoraith attackers like a firefly in a storm. It dodged blasts with incredible agility, its engines screaming as it swerved through tight turns, and barely avoided the deadly energy blasts from the Zoraith ships. It was chaos around them, but somehow Jensen kept her cool, calculating each movement with the precision of a chess master. Every twist and turn of the ship had a purpose. Even when it seemed like they were on the verge of destruction, the crew held steady. "We've got one on our tail," the communications officer called out. "We need to shake them off." "Do whatever it takes," Jensen responded. "We can't let them catch us." The crew worked in perfect unison. As Jensen guided the ship closer to the asteroid field, she knew it would be their only chance to survive. The next few moments were crucial. Every second counted. The Zoraith were closing in. Their ships were deadly, but Jensen knew one thing: they didn't expect humanity's ingenuity, and they didn't expect the Titan's wrath to fight back so fiercely. The small vessel dived into the asteroid field at full speed, a dangerous maneuver, but their only hope. It slipped between the massive asteroids with only inches to spare as the Zoraith ships struggled to follow the smaller human ship through the narrow gaps. The enemy pilots weren't used to such evasive tactics. Their ships were too large, too clunky, and they found themselves caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse as the Titan's wrath danced between the asteroids, picking off their numbers one by one. Jensen grinned to herself. She knew that in this battle humanity had something the Zoraith couldn't counter. They had the will to survive, and the courage to fight with everything they had. The Zoraith forces were starting to realize that they were being outplayed. They had been so sure of their victory, but now their best pilots were being systematically outmaneuvered by a ship they had underestimated. It was a small ship not even designed for full-scale combat, but it was proving to be a nightmare for the Zoraith. Commander Zorthak clenched his teeth in frustration. He had underestimated humanity, and that was a mistake he was not willing to repeat. "Get me a full analysis on the human vessel now," he barked, his patience wearing thin. The tactical officer quickly ran the calculations. "Sir, the Titan's wrath is using the asteroid field to its advantage. The human crew is employing unconventional tactics. They're outwitting our pilots by taking risks we wouldn't dare." Zorthak growled with annoyance. He had expected humanity to fold under the pressure, but instead they were turning the very battlefield against him. On the bridge of the Titan's wrath, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen was fully aware that the clock was ticking. They had already lost precious time, and their window of opportunity was closing. The Zoraith Armada was regrouping, and she knew it wouldn't be long before they sent in reinforcements. She glanced at the damage report. The ship was taking hits left and right. Its hull was scared from the Zoraith's laser fire. The engines were sputtering under the strain, but it was still holding together. The Titan's wrath was built for speed, not for this kind of prolonged conflict, but it was doing its job well enough. "Commander, the shields are at 20%, the engineer called out. "We can't take much more of this." "We need to buy more time," Jensen replied, her mind racing. She had one last card to play, but it was risky, incredibly risky. If it didn't work, they would all die. "Get me a direct line to the captain," Jensen ordered. Captain Mason's voice came through the comms, a bit distorted. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." "Sir, we've got a prototype weapon on board the Titan's wrath," Jensen explained quickly. "It's a one-time use energy cannon designed to take out large enemy targets, but it requires a direct hit, and we have to get dangerously close to the flagship to make it work." Mason's response was immediate. "Do it, Lieutenant. If it's our only shot, take it, but be careful, we can't afford to lose you." Jensen nodded, even though she knew Mason couldn't see it. "Understood, sir, we're going in." The Titan's wrath adjusted its course. The crew braced themselves for what was to come. They had taken heavy damage, but there was no turning back now. This was humanity's last hope. The energy cannon was their most powerful weapon, but it was only useful if they could get close enough to the Zoraith flagship to fire. "Here we go," Jensen muttered to herself as she navigated the ship through the asteroid field once again. Only this time they weren't evading the enemy, they were heading straight toward them. The Zoraith flagship loomed ahead, its shields flickering as it prepared to launch another devastating assault on Earth's remaining ships. But Jensen was faster. Her hands flew over the controls, guiding the Titan's wrath through the tightest spaces. Her heart raced as the distance between them and the flagship closed. "Just a little closer," Jensen whispered to herself as the energy cannon powered up, the ship's core vibrating under the strain. The crew held their breath, waiting for the signal that would decide everything. "Prepare to fire," Jensen said with steely resolve. "This is it." The Titan's wrath was closing the distance. The Zoraith flagship was now in its sights. The ship was taking everything the Zoraith had to offer: the barrage of energy blasts, the constant tracking lasers, the relentless pursuit of their elite squadron. And yet the Titan's wrath kept pushing forward through the chaos. Jensen's hands flew over the controls, guiding the ship closer to the heart of the enemy formation. "Commander, shields at 10%. The engineer reported, his voice strained but steady. "We can't hold out much longer." Jensen didn't respond. She was focused entirely on the task at hand. The weapon she was about to fire was humanity's last hope. If it didn't hit the flagship, it would be over for them all. The distance between the Titan's wrath and the flagship was rapidly closing. They were nearly within range of the cannon, but every passing moment brought them closer to destruction. The Zoraith were not going to let them make it to the target without a fight. "They're right behind us," the radar officer called out, a late squadron closing in fast. Jensen knew that if she didn't act now, they would be surrounded. There was no more time for hesitation. The Titan's Wrath had already taken so much damage it wouldn't survive another round of direct hits, but she couldn't afford to stop now. This was their only chance. "All hands brace for impact," she ordered, her voice calm, but her heart pounded in her chest. "We're going in." With one final burst at speed, the Titan's Wrath darted forward. It weaved through enemy fire with a deadly precision, as if guided by something more than just human hands. The ship cut through the Zorith formation, its engines screaming as it pushed every ounce of power they had left. The Zorith flagship loomed large ahead. It was massive and imposing, but for Jensen there was no fear, only a cold determination. She had come too far to back down. Now they were going to win, or they were going to die trying. "Hold steady," Jensen muttered to herself as she prepared to fire the cannon. The ship was taking heavy damage. Now the hull groaned under the pressure, but it was still moving, still fighting. The crew knew what was at stake, and they were ready to give everything they had to make this shot count. "Cannon charged," the weapons officer called out. "Ready to fire on your mark." "Lock onto the flagship," Jensen ordered. As she adjusted the targeting systems, her heart raced as she watched the numbers tick down. They were mere seconds away from firing. The Titan's Wrath had reached the heart of the Zorith Armada, and the flagship was now directly in its sights. Jensen's hands gripped the controls tightly, her eyes never leaving the target. The moment was here. Everything depended on this one shot. "Firing in 3, 2, 1. The weapons officer counted down, his voice steady but tight with tension. The Titan's Wrath released a deafening roar as the energy cannon fired. The blast shot forward with incredible force. It cut through the vacuum of space. Like a bolt of lightning, the wave of power surged toward the Zorith flagship. "This is it," Jensen thought as she watched the energy blast closing the gap. The flagship's shields flickered for a moment, but they weren't enough. The cannon struck the flagship head-on, with an explosion that shook the very fabric of space itself. The Zorith flagship erupted in a blinding flash of light. As the blast tore through its hull, its massive structure was torn apart in a single moment of pure devastation. Jensen felt the shockwave reverberate through the Titan's Wrath. The ship rocked from the impact, but they had done it. They had destroyed the Zorith flagship, and with it shattered the heart of the invaders' armada. "We did it," Jensen whispered as the crew erupted into cheers around her. But she knew the battle wasn't over yet. The Zorith forces were still regrouping, but the tide had turned. The humans had struck the first real blow in this war, and they weren't going to stop now. The explosion of the Zorith flagship sent shockwaves through the battlefield. The Zorith forces were momentarily thrown into disarray, their once unshakable confidence now shattered in the wake of their flagship's destruction. On the bridge of the Titan's Wrath, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen breathed a sigh of relief, but only for a moment. She knew this victory was just a small part of the bigger picture. The Zorith were still out there regrouping, and their thirst for vengeance would not be easily quenched. "All units form up," Captain Mason's voice crackled through the comms. "We're not done yet, stay sharp." Jensen glanced at her crew. They had all felt the weight of that victory, but they knew it was far from over. The Titan's Wrath had been pushed to its limits, and its damaged systems were only barely functioning. They could feel the ship's hull groaning with every movement. It made the blast from the energy cannon had taken everything the ship had, but now they were on the edge of something even more dangerous. "Commander, they're regrouping," the radar officer called out urgently. "They're forming up a new strategy. They're not retreating." "They wouldn't," Jensen muttered. She knew the Zorith, they wouldn't back down so easily, and now they were angrier than ever before. "We need to keep them off balance," Jensen said, her voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. "We have to hit them hard and fast before they can recover." "Commander, we're getting reports from the rest of the fleet," Lieutenant Jensen's voice cut in from the communication station. "The enemy forces are scattered, but they're pulling together for one final assault. They're focusing everything on us." Jensen's eyes narrowed. She could feel the weight of the situation settling in. The humans had made a powerful strike, but it had come at a cost. Now the Zorith were bringing everything they had left to crush them, and the rest of humanity's fleet was in no better shape than they were. "We're going to need every last ship we have," Jensen said, her mind racing. As she weighed their options, she looked out the view screen. The Zoraith forces were closing in their ships, forming a vast wall of destruction as they prepared for their final push. "All hands brace for impact," she ordered. "This isn't over yet, but we can still win." On the comms, Captain Mason's voice was filled with a rare kind of intensity. "This is humanity's last stand. We hold the line here, or we lose everything. Don't give them an inch. Fight like hell." The crew nodded in unison. They had been pushed to the brink, but they were not about to let their world fall without a fight. The Titan's wrath might be damaged, but it was still standing, and the crew had one final mission to complete. "Ready all weapons," Jensen called out to the weapons officer. "Target their lead ships. Take down their formation." The weapons officer didn't hesitate. Weapons online, targeting the lead ships now. The Titan's wrath fired its remaining cannons. The blasts hit their marks, tearing into the Zoraith formation ships, exploded in a shower of debris as humanity's last hope, struck with deadly accuracy. But the Zoraith were not deterred. They pressed forward with brutal force, their ships charging toward the human fleet with all the fury they could muster. The battle had become a desperate struggle for survival. The air was thick with tension as the two forces clashed. "They're coming in fast," Jensen said, her eyes focused on the view screen. She could feel the heat of the battle rising, but there was no turning back now. They would fight until their last breath, or they would fall together. "This is it," Jensen whispered to herself as the Zoraith ships closed in and the final showdown began. The final assault had begun, and the battlefield was a chaotic mess of flashing lights, explosions, and the deafening roar of weapons. Fire. The Zoraith had thrown everything they had left at humanity's remaining fleet. Their ships pressed forward like an unstoppable wave, but the humans were holding their ground. On the bridge of the Titan's wrath, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen felt her heart pounding in her chest. The ship was battered, and the crew was exhausted, but there was no time for hesitation, no time for fear. They had come too far to lose now. "Commander, we've got another wave coming in from the left flank," the radar officer reported urgently. "They're closing in fast." Jensen's fingers danced over the controls, her mind racing as she assessed their situation. The Titan's wrath had no choice but to stay in the fight. Every human ship left was at the mercy of the Zoraith, and they needed every second they could get to stay alive. "Fire at will," Jensen ordered. "Take out as many as we can." The Titan's wrath fired its remaining cannons, the blasts rocketing toward the approaching Zoraith ships. The energy cannons roared with power as they struck the lead ships, ripping them apart in blinding flashes of light. But the Zoraith kept coming, relentless and determined. "Their shields are too strong," the weapons officer shouted over the noise of the explosions. "We need to hit them from the inside." "We can't get that close," Jensen said through clenched teeth. She knew what they needed to do, but the risk was too great. She glanced at the damage reports again. The ship was barely holding together. The engines were running on fumes, the shields were flickering, and they were down to their last few weapons. And yet they had no choice. They had to make a move. "Prepare the last charge," Jensen ordered. "We're going in." The bridge fell silent as the crew understood the gravity of her command. This was it, the last chance. The Titan's wrath had to make a difference, the final maneuver that could tip the balance in humanity's favor. But it was a suicide mission. There was no coming back from this. "Ready, sir," the weapons officer said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Lock on to the flagship," Jensen commanded. "We're going for the heart of their fleet." She felt the ship lurch forward as the Titan's wrath surged toward the center of the Zoraith formation, their ships coming into view faster than ever before. The massive flagship loomed ahead, but this time Jensen wasn't avoiding it. She was heading straight for it. "We've got incoming fire," the radar officer shouted. "They're all over us." The Titan's wrath shook violently as the Zoraith ships unleashed a torrent of weapons fire against the tiny human vessel. But Jensen didn't flinch. She kept her focus on the flagship. The target was within reach. Now Jensen barked, and with a fierce determination, she ordered the final charge to be initiated. The Titan's Wrath's engines roared to life, pushing the ship forward with all the power they had left. The crew held on as the ship cut through the enemy fire, its shields collapsing under the strain. The ship was falling apart around them, but they had to reach the flagship. With a deafening explosion, the final charge was unleashed. The energy surge slammed into the Zorath flagship's core, tearing through its defenses. The ship trembled as it absorbed the blast, and in that instant Jensen knew the tide had turned. The flagship of the Zorath Armada exploded in a massive fireball that illuminated the entire battlefield. For a moment, everything was still. The Zorath had lost their command center, their hope, their force was broken, and humanity had struck the decisive blow. "It's done," Jensen whispered as she watched the chaos unfold around her, knowing that the battle had shifted in their favor. But at what cost? The Titan's wrath had given everything, and there was no turning back now. The aftermath of the explosion was a sight unlike anything the crew of the Titan's Wrath had ever witnessed. The Zorath flagship had erupted in a brilliant burst of light, followed by a shockwave that rippled across the battlefield. The Zorath Armada seemed to falter for a moment, as if unsure of what had just happened. Their lines broke, and chaos spread through their ranks. On the bridge of the Titan's Wrath, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jensen stared at the view screen, her hands still gripping the controls. The ship was shaking with the aftermath of the blast, but they had done it. They had struck a decisive blow to the heart of the Zorath forces. "Commander, the Zorath are retreating," the radar officer reported in disbelief. "They're pulling back, they're scattering across the system." Jensen allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The Zorath were unpredictable, and their retreat could just be a tactical move to regroup or prepare for a larger counterattack. "Stay sharp," Jensen ordered. "We need to make sure they don't regroup or plan another strike against us. We need to finish this now while we have the advantage." The crew of the Titan's Wrath moved quickly into action. They had fought through every obstacle and endured countless hardships, but now they were faced with the final challenge. They needed to ensure the Zorath would not return to take humanity's future. "Captain Mason, what's the status of the rest of the fleet?" Jensen asked as she made calculations on the ship's remaining fuel and weapons. "We're holding steady," Mason's voice came through the comms. "But we're not out of the woods yet. The Zorath still have a sizable force. We'll need to neutralize them before they can escape and regroup." Jensen's eyes narrowed. She understood what had to be done. They were all running on fumes, their ships battered, and their crews weary. But humanity had to take this final step to ensure their survival. They had to push the Zorath to the brink and eliminate their presence once and for all. "Target their remaining ships," Jensen commanded. "We'll hit them hard while they're vulnerable." The Titan's Wrath fired once more, its cannons lighting up the darkness of space. The blasts hit their marks, tearing into the last of the Zorath ships. As they attempted to flee the battle, they hadn't counted on humanity's resilience. They hadn't counted on a force that would rise from the ashes and fight back with everything they had. The Zorath began to scatter, their forces disintegrating under the relentless assault of humanity's fleet. Their ships were slow to respond, their shields weakened, and their morale shattered by the destruction of their flagship. But Jensen knew that this wasn't just about victory. It was about sending a message to any who would threaten humanity. They were not weak, they were not afraid, and they would not bow down. As the Zorath forces disintegrated and the last of their ships fell silent, Jensen allowed herself to take a deep breath. The battle had been won, but the cost had been high. The Titan's Wrath was in ruins, its hull a mangled wreck, but it had achieved the impossible, and so had humanity. The crew cheered as they watched the final remnants of the Zorath fleet vanish into the void, but Jensen couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Their world had been saved, but the galaxy was vast, and there would always be more threats lurking in the darkness. "We made it," Jensen whispered to herself, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. They had survived, and humanity had proven once and for all that they would never give up. The journey was far from over, but for now the fight was won, and humanity's future had been secured.